Hello everyone, I am the Boring Historian, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from, and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The crack of cannon fire, the clash of steel, the hoarse shouts of sailors, these sounds have long defined our collective imagination of piracy in the age of sail. Yet amid these quintessentially masculine images lurks a lesser-told story, that of women who defied convention, law, and often certain death to become pirates themselves. Their tales begin with daring escapes, calculated risks, and desperate measures. But how did these stories end? What fate awaited women who were captured after sailing under the Jolly Roger? When Anne Bonny allegedly told her lover, the pirate captain Calico Jack Rackham, "If you had fought like a man, you need not have been hanged like a dog," she revealed much about the complex interplay of gender and justice that awaited captured female pirates. Her words, recorded in Captain Charles Johnson's influential 1724 book, A General History of the Pirates, hint at a legal system unprepared to handle women who had stepped so dramatically outside their prescribed social roles. This historical investigation delves deep into the records, trial transcripts, newspaper accounts, and personal letters that reveal what happened to female pirates after their capture. It examines not just the famous cases, Anne Bonny and Mary Read chief among them, but also lesser-known women who faced maritime justice systems across different periods and cultures. Through their stories, we gain insight into how gender shaped both the crime of piracy and the punishment that followed. The fate of female pirates after capture was not uniform. Some faced the hangman's noose alongside their male counterparts. Others leveraged their gender through pregnancy claims or appeals to femininity. Some disappeared from historical records entirely, their ultimate fate a mystery that continues to intrigue historians centuries later. A select few even managed to negotiate their way back into respectable society, leaving their piratical pasts behind. By examining these divergent outcomes, we can better understand not just the history of women in piracy, but also the complex legal, social, and cultural frameworks that dictated their treatment after capture. Their stories reveal much about historical attitudes toward gender roles, criminal justice, and the sometimes tenuous boundary between outlaws and citizens in maritime societies. This exploration begins with the context, the golden age of piracy, when female pirates reached their most visible historical moment. From there, we'll examine the legal frameworks that governed their trials, the courtroom proceedings themselves, and the various outcomes that awaited these extraordinary women when their seafaring days came to an abrupt end. The period between 1650 and 1730, commonly known as the Golden Age of Piracy, saw unprecedented levels of maritime lawlessness. Following the end of the War of Spanish Succession in 1714, thousands of experienced sailors found themselves suddenly unemployed, with naval powers drastically reducing their fleets. Many turned to piracy, finding in this criminal enterprise not just a means of survival, but sometimes a path to riches beyond what legitimate maritime work could offer. The political landscape created ideal conditions for piracy to flourish. The Caribbean, with its myriad islands and competing European colonial interests, became a particular hotspot. Jamaica, the Bahamas, and Tortuga emerged as pirate havens where authorities either couldn't or wouldn't enforce maritime law. The triangular trade between Europe, Africa, and the Americas offered wealthy targets, while the distance from Europe meant news of pirate attacks traveled slowly, giving pirates ample time to disappear before naval vessels could respond. This was the world into which women like Anne Bonny and Mary Read entered. a world nominally closed to their gender, but which, in its lawlessness, sometimes offered paradoxical opportunities. Seafaring in general has historically been a highly masculine gendered activity, notes maritime historian Marcus Rediker. Women were rarely allowed on pirate ships, and many vessels explicitly prohibited female presence through their articles, the quasi-democratic contracts that governed pirate crews. These prohibitions stemmed from superstition. Women were considered bad luck at sea, and practical concerns about romantic entanglements disrupting crew unity. Despite these barriers, historical records confirm approximately 40 women actively participated in piracy during this golden age. They joined this dangerous profession through various avenues. Some disguised themselves as men, others joined with pirate lovers or husbands, and a few were captured at sea and chose piracy over death or other fates. The economics of the Golden Age also explain why some women risked everything to join pirate crews. A successful pirate could earn more in one raid than a legitimate sailor might see in years. For women of the period, whose economic opportunities were severely limited, the financial rewards of piracy could be particularly compelling. A female servant might earn 2 to 3 pounds per year, while her share of a single successful pirate raid could exceed £500, a life-changing sum. Social conditions for women in the 17th and early 18th centuries further illuminate why some chose this dangerous path. Most women faced strictly limited roles, wife, mother, servant, or prostitute being the primary options. Even women with some financial independence, such as tavern keepers or shopkeepers, operated under significant legal and social constraints. Piracy, for all its dangers, offered a rare taste of freedom and agency that legitimate society denied them. This was particularly true for women who adopted male dress aboard pirate ships. As historian Diane Dugas has observed, a woman disguised as a man could move about the same world with safety and freedom. Court records from the trial of Anne Bonny and Mary Read confirm this observation, noting that both women wore men's jackets and long trousers and handkerchiefs tied about their heads, and each of them had a machete and pistol in their hands. The Golden Age created not just economic and social conditions conducive to female piracy, but also cultural ones. As traditional hierarchies faced challenges from Enlightenment thinking, some women found space to question their assigned roles. The period has been called the Age of Disguise by some historians, a time when identity, including gender identity, was not yet fixed in the rigid categories that would emerge in later centuries. Against this backdrop of economic opportunity, social limitation, and cultural flux, women who became pirates made a radical choice. Understanding this context is crucial to comprehending what happened when they were captured and forced to confront legal systems designed by and for men. When captured female pirates faced trial, they entered legal systems never designed with them in mind. Maritime law had evolved over centuries to address the particulars of crime at sea, but almost exclusively as it pertained to male offenders. The resulting legal frameworks created both unexpected vulnerabilities and surprising opportunities for women who found themselves facing piracy charges. Piracy held a unique legal status. It was considered hostis humani generis, enemy of all mankind. This designation, dating back to Roman law, placed pirates outside the protection of any nation. Anyone could capture and try a pirate, regardless of the pirate's or captor's nationality. By the 18th century, Britain had developed the most comprehensive legal approach to piracy, embodied in the 1698 Act for the more effectual suppression of piracy and its subsequent revisions. Under these laws, piracy was a capital offense. The statutes did not distinguish between male and female pirates. The punishment was hanging regardless of gender. However, in practice, courts often struggled with how to apply these laws to women, particularly given the period's assumptions about female agency, or lack thereof. Trial locations varied depending on where pirates were captured. Some faced special admiralty courts in colonial outposts like Port Royal, Jamaica, or Nassau in the Bahamas. Others were transported back to England for trial at the Admiralty Sessions at the Old Bailey in London. These different venues sometimes produced markedly different outcomes for female pirates based on local attitudes toward women and crime. The legal concept of femme covert, covered woman, complicated matters further. Under this common law doctrine, a married woman had no independent legal existence. Her identity was subsumed into her husband's. A married woman who committed crimes in her husband's presence was presumed to be acting under his coercion, potentially providing a legal defense not available to male pirates. Court records from the period reveal how this doctrine influenced proceedings against female pirates. During the 1720 trial of Anne Bonny, her relationship with Captain John Rackham became a central question. Had she acted independently or under his influence? The court ultimately rejected any presumption of coercion, in part because witnesses testified that Bonny had been very ready and willing to do anything on board and had actively participated in pirate attacks. The evidentiary standards in piracy trials also affected outcomes for female defendants. Conviction required testimony from at least 2 witnesses who could place the accused at the scene of a pirate attack. For women who remained below decks during raids or who disguised themselves as men, such evidence could be difficult for prosecutors to produce. Another critical legal consideration was the benefit of clergy, a provision originally allowing literate people, primarily clergy, to escape capital punishment for certain crimes by demonstrating literacy. By the 18th century, this had evolved into a legal fiction that often allowed first-time offenders to avoid the death penalty. However, the 1698 Piracy Act specifically excluded this benefit in piracy cases, closing off an avenue of mercy that might otherwise have been available to female pirates. Legal procedures for pregnant women constituted perhaps the most significant gender-specific aspect of piracy trials. Under common law, a pregnant woman convicted of a capital crime could plead the belly and request a stay of execution until after childbirth. A jury of matrons would examine the woman to confirm pregnancy. This provision, designed to prevent the execution of an innocent unborn child, offered a crucial reprieve for pregnant female pirates that their male counterparts could not access. Maritime justice was also deeply intertwined with politics. Colonial governors wielded significant discretionary power over piracy trials and could pardon pirates who provided valuable information or who had powerful connections. This discretionary element sometimes worked to women's advantage, as female pirates could appeal to gendered notions of mercy and redemption. The legal frameworks governing piracy trials thus created a complex landscape for female defendants, one where gender could be both a liability and an asset. Understanding these frameworks is essential to comprehending why some female pirates met swift justice at the end of a rope, while others secured pardons or disappeared from historical record altogether. No accounting of female pirates and their fates can begin anywhere but with Anne Bonny and Mary Read. Their stories, intertwined by circumstance and preserved through Captain Charles Johnson's influential work, represent the most thoroughly documented cases of women who faced justice for piracy during the Golden Age. Anne Bonny was born in Ireland around 1697, the illegitimate daughter of lawyer William Cormac and his maid. After the scandal of her birth became known, Cormac relocated with his daughter to Charleston, South Carolina, where he established a successful plantation. By most accounts, Anne was fiery and independent from an early age. She scandalized Charleston society by marrying a poor sailor named James Bonney against her father's wishes. The couple eventually relocated to Nassau in the Bahamas, a notorious pirate haven. There, Anne met and became enamored with John Calico Jack Rackham, an up-and-coming pirate captain. She abandoned her husband to join Rackham's crew, becoming both his lover and a pirate in her own right. Mary Read's path to piracy followed an even more unusual trajectory. Born in England around 1685, she was disguised as a boy from childhood after her mother lost her husband and legitimate son. This deception, initially undertaken to secure financial support from her paternal grandmother, continued into adulthood. Mary served in both the Army and Navy, maintaining her male disguise. After leaving military service, she briefly married and operated an inn with her husband. After his death, she returned to sea, still dressed as a man. When her ship was captured by pirates, she joined their crew rather than resisting. Eventually, she found herself aboard Calico Jack's vessel, where she and Anne Bonney discovered each other's true gender and formed a close bond. Both women actively participated in piracy between 1718 and 1720, a relatively brief but notorious career. Contemporary accounts describe them as fierce fighters who dressed in men's clothes during battles, but sometimes revealed their gender at other times. They were among the small crew of Rackham's sloop when it was captured by pirate hunter Captain Jonathan Barnett near Jamaica in October 1720. The capture itself was unremarkable. Barnett's vessel, commissioned by Jamaican Governor Nicholas Laws, surprised Rackham's crew while many, including Rackham himself, were drunk below decks. According to legend, only Anne and Mary offered significant resistance, cursing their male companions for cowardice as they fought. The subsequent trial in Spanish Town, Jamaica, proceeded swiftly. On November 16, 1720, Rackham and his male crew members were tried, convicted, and sentenced to hang. 2 days later, Anne Bonney and Mary Read faced their own trial. The court transcript, preserved in the Trials of Captain John Rackham and Other Pirates, 1721, reveals the particular challenges faced by female defendants. The prosecution called several witnesses, including Dorothy Thomas, who testified that the two women, prisoners at the bar, were then on board the said sloop, and that they were both very active on board and willing to do anything. This testimony undermined any potential defense based on coercion or passive presence. Other witnesses confirmed seeing Bonney and Read dressed as men, armed with pistols and machetes. The prosecution successfully established that both women had participated voluntarily in pirate attacks, satisfying the legal requirements for a piracy conviction. On November 28, 1720, both women were found guilty and sentenced to hang. Their response to this sentence would dramatically alter their fates and secure their place in pirate lore. According to the trial record, both Bonney and Read pleaded their bellies, claiming to be pregnant and thereby invoking the legal provision that stayed execution for expectant mothers. A jury of matrons examined them and confirmed their pregnancies, resulting in a temporary reprieve from the gallows. What happened next remains one of history's most tantalizing mysteries. Mary Read is known to have died in prison in April 1721, likely from a fever related to her pregnancy. Her child either died with her or shortly afterward, leaving no descendants. Anne Bonney's fate, however, is far less certain. No record of her execution exists, suggesting she was not hanged after giving birth. Some historians believe her wealthy father secured her release and returned to Charleston, where she may have lived out her days in obscurity. Others suggest she may have returned to her husband, James Bonney, or even rejoined piracy under a different identity. The last recorded words attributed to Anne Bonny come from her supposed final meeting with Rackham before his execution, when she delivered her famous rebuke, "I am sorry to see you here, but if you had fought like a man, you need not have been hanged like a dog." The cases of Bonny and Reed highlight several key aspects of how female pirates were treated after capture. Both received the same legal proceedings as their male counterparts, with no special leniency shown during the trial itself. Their gender became legally relevant only after conviction, when pregnancy offered a mechanism to delay and ultimately avoid execution. Their story also demonstrates how female pirates occupied an ambiguous space in the legal and cultural imagination of their time. They were simultaneously oddities to be examined, criminals to be punished, and curiosities to be documented. This ambiguity would shape not just their treatment, but also how their stories would be told and retold in the centuries that followed. The courtroom offered no quarter to female pirates. They entered spaces designed for male defendants, faced judges accustomed to trying men, and confronted legal systems that had rarely needed to consider how gender might influence culpability or punishment for maritime crimes. The resulting proceedings reveal much about both the legal and social status of women who had transgressed not just laws, but gender norms. Admiralty courts operated under distinctive procedures that differed from common law courts. Defendants faced a panel of judges rather than a jury of peers. These judges typically included naval officers, colonial officials, and merchants, men with vested interests in maritime commerce and security. For female pirates, this meant being judged by men who represented the very systems they had rejected. The physical setting of these trials often underscored the exceptional nature of female piracy cases. In Jamaica, trials took place in the governor's mansion in Spanish Town, a venue that emphasized colonial authority. When Anne Bonny and Mary Read stood before this court in November 1720, they did so in a room filled with men, judges, witnesses, spectators, and fellow defendants. Contemporary accounts suggest their presence caused considerable sensation. Trial records reveal a particular focus on establishing that female defendants had actively chosen piracy rather than being coerced. This emphasis reflected period assumptions about female agency, or lack thereof. During the trial of Anne Bonny and Mary Read, prosecutor Richard Mill repeatedly asked witnesses to confirm that both women had participated willingly in pirate attacks. One witness, Dorothy Thomas, testified that she saw the two women prisoners at the bar very active on board the said sloop, and that they did help to rob the said sloop, and that they were both very ready and willing to do anything. Such testimony was crucial because it overcame potential defenses based on the doctrine of coverture or coercion. Under British law, married women were presumed to act under their husband's influence, potentially mitigating their criminal liability. By establishing that female pirates had acted independently and enthusiastically, prosecutors foreclosed this avenue of defense. Physical appearance and dress became significant factors in trials of female pirates. Witnesses were often asked to describe how the women presented themselves during attacks. Thomas testified that Bonny and Read wore men's jackets and long trousers and handkerchiefs tied about their heads, and had a machete and pistol in their hands. This testimony served dual purposes, establishing the women's active participation while also emphasizing their transgression of gender norms. In some cases, female pirates attempted to use gender expectations to their advantage during trials. Historical records suggest that some women changed from male attire to feminine dress for court appearances, hoping to appeal to judges' gallantry or to reinforce claims that they had been unwilling participants. This strategy met with mixed success. While period accounts suggest judges sometimes struggled with sentencing women to death, trial outcomes indicate little leniency in the actual verdict phase. Language used in court proceedings and subsequent records also reveals contemporary attitudes toward female pirates. They were often described in terms that emphasize their deviation from proper womanhood. Court documents from various trials use phrases like unnatural women, monsters in human form, and defiers of God's ordained order to describe female pirates. Such language framed their crimes as not just violations of law, but of natural and divine order. Female pirates also faced gender-specific questioning that male defendants did not. Court records show women being interrogated about their sexual relationships with male crew members, their reasons for abandoning feminine virtues, and whether they had children. These questions had little bearing on the legal elements of piracy, but reflected societal concerns about women who had rejected traditional roles. The case of Mary Cricket, also recorded as Mary Critchett in 1729, illustrates how courts approached female pirates who lacked the notoriety of Bonnie and Reed. Cricket was part of a crew of escaped felons who stole a ship in Virginia's Rappahannock River and engaged in piracy in the Chesapeake Bay. Unlike some female pirates, Cricket made no attempt to disguise her gender. At her trial in Williamsburg, Virginia, witnesses testified that she had been an eager participant in the crew's crimes, cursing and swearing with the best of them, and helping to secure captives. Despite attempts by her defense to portray her as an unwilling companion to the male pirates, the court found her guilty and sentenced her to hang alongside her male counterparts. Unlike Bonnie and Reed, Cricket could not plead her belly and was executed in 1729, one of the few female pirates whose execution is confirmed in historical records. The trial of Martha Farley, also recorded as Mary Farley, the previous year in the same Virginia court, offers an instructive contrast. Farley was tried alongside 3 male pirates, but received different treatment. Although witnesses placed her aboard the pirate vessel during attacks, testimony suggested she had played a less active role than Cricket would later. The court spared Farley while sentencing her male co-defendants to death. This outcome hints at the importance of perceived levels of participation in determining a female pirate's fate after trial. The legal proceedings against female pirates reveal a system grappling with exceptions to its usual operations. While courts generally applied the same standards of evidence and same legal frameworks to women as to men, the underlying assumptions about gender created subtle but significant differences in how cases proceeded and how outcomes were determined. These differences would become even more pronounced after conviction, when the question of punishment brought gender considerations to the forefront. For female pirates facing the death penalty, pregnancy offered a unique legal avenue unavailable to their male counterparts. The practice of pleading the belly, formerly known as pleading benefit of the womb or pleading pregnancy, provided convicted women with what was initially a temporary reprieve from execution, but which sometimes became a de facto commutation of the death sentence. This legal mechanism stemmed from the ancient principle that an unborn child should not suffer for the crimes of its mother. By the 18th century, it had become a well-established element of British common law, applicable in all capital cases, including piracy. The procedure was straightforward but intimate. After conviction and sentencing, a woman could declare her pregnancy to the court. A jury of matrons, a panel of 12 experienced, usually married women, would then physically examine her to verify the claim. If the jury confirmed the pregnancy Execution would be stayed until after childbirth. The legal term for this reprieve was a respite. Importantly, this was not a pardon, but a delay, with the sentence theoretically still to be carried out after delivery. In practice, however, many women who successfully pleaded pregnancy ultimately escaped execution entirely through either formal pardons granted during the respite period or through administrative neglect that left them in legal limbo. The cases of Anne Bonny and Mary Read represent the most famous application of this principle in piracy cases. Court records from their trial confirm that immediately after receiving their death sentences on November 28, 1720, both women declared themselves pregnant. The court ordered an examination, and a jury of matrons confirmed both pregnancies, resulting in stays of execution. Mary Read's subsequent death in prison from fever in April 1721 rendered her reprieve moot. Anne Bonny's case proved more complex. No record exists of her execution, suggesting she survived beyond childbirth. Governor Nicholas Laws of Jamaica, in correspondence dated October 1720, wrote of Bonny, "The woman be in a way of pregnancy which has reprieved her from execution." No subsequent mention of carrying out her sentence appears in colonial records. This silence has fueled centuries of speculation. Did Bonny receive a formal pardon, perhaps through her father's influence? Did she simply slip through administrative cracks during a change in colonial leadership? Or did she escape or secure release through some unrecorded means? The historical record remains frustratingly silent, demonstrating how pregnancy could create not just legal, but historical ambiguities for female pirates. The efficacy of pleading pregnancy varied depending on time and place. In England itself, where administrative systems were more robust, women who pleaded the belly were more likely to eventually face execution after childbirth. In colonial settings like Jamaica or Virginia, where record keeping was sometimes haphazard and administrative transitions frequent, a pregnancy plea more often resulted in de facto commutation. Not all female pirates had access to this defense. Women past childbearing age, those not sexually active with men, or those who simply were not pregnant when captured, could not benefit from this provision. The case of Mary Cricket illustrates this limitation. Tried and convicted in Virginia in 1729, Cricket either could not or did not claim pregnancy and was executed alongside her male co-defendants. The verification process itself reflected period understanding of pregnancy detection. The jury of matrons relied primarily on physical examination, looking for physical signs like breast changes and abdominal swelling. Without modern pregnancy tests, these examinations were imperfect, occasionally allowing non-pregnant women to successfully claim the benefit. Historical records suggest some women deliberately gained weight or padded their clothing before examination to create the appearance of pregnancy. In some cases, the mere possibility of pregnancy could create legal complications. Rachel Wall, considered the first American-born female pirate, was executed in Massachusetts in 1789 for robbery rather than piracy. Historical accounts suggest questions about her possible pregnancy arose, but were ultimately dismissed by authorities eager to carry out her sentence, reflecting how this legal provision could become entangled with broader questions about mercy and justice for female criminals. Beyond its immediate legal implications, pleading the belly carried social significance. It required women to publicly acknowledge sexual activity, potentially scandalous for unmarried women, and subjected them to intimate physical examination. For female pirates who had lived outside social conventions, this procedure represented a jarring reassertion of social control over their bodies. The practice also created complex moral questions. A woman who successfully pleaded pregnancy might gain her life, but would give birth in prison under harsh conditions. Children born to convicted pirates typically became orphans or wards of the parish, facing bleak prospects. This reality added another layer of calculation to the decision to invoke this defense. By the late 18th century, the practice began to evolve. Courts became increasingly reluctant to execute women regardless of pregnancy status, and the process became more a formality, leading to commutation rather than a temporary reprieve. This evolution reflected broader shifts in attitudes toward gender and punishment that would eventually lead to the formal abolition of capital punishment for women in many jurisdictions. For female pirates of the Golden Age, however, pleading the belly represented a critical intersection of gender, biology, and law. A rare instance where their womanhood provided an advantage rather than a disadvantage in the legal system. Whether they viewed this provision as a blessing or another form of control likely depended on their individual circumstances and the ultimate outcome of their reprieve. While Anne Bonny and Mary Read dominate historical accounts of female piracy, numerous other women faced capture and punishment for maritime crimes. Their stories, though less thoroughly documented, provide crucial context for understanding the range of fates that awaited female pirates across different time periods and jurisdictions. Martha Herring represents one of the earliest documented cases from the Golden Age. Accounts suggest she was the daughter of a captain killed in a 1714 mutiny led by her lover, Sandy Gordon, who subsequently turned to piracy. Herring followed Gordon aboard the vessel Flying Scot, participating in pirate raids along the North American coast. After Gordon's death in 1715, Herring reportedly remained on an island where the couple had married. Unlike many female pirates, Herring appears to have avoided capture and trial altogether, highlighting how some women managed to exit piratical life before facing justice. The case of Martha Farley, sometimes recorded as Mary Farley or Mary Harvey, offers insight into how courts sometimes distinguished between levels of female participation in piracy. Tried in Virginia in 1726 alongside 3 male pirates, Farley was spared execution, while her male counterparts went to the gallows. Court records indicate that while Farley was present during ship captures, witnesses did not describe her taking direct violent action. Instead, testimony suggested she had primarily aided the pirates by eavesdropping on prisoners. This relative passivity, combined with period gender assumptions, appears to have influenced the court's decision to show mercy, a mercy not extended to more active female pirates like Mary Cricket 3 years later. Flora Burns' experience demonstrates how women sometimes participated in legal maritime predation through privateering rather than outright piracy. Records from 1741 confirm Burns served aboard the American privateer HMS Revenge, holding a 1 3/4 share of the bounty. As a privateer operating with a letter of marque, government authorization to attack enemy vessels, Burn occupied a legally sanctioned role that kept her from facing the consequences that befell illegal pirates. Her case illustrates the sometimes thin line between legitimate and illegitimate maritime predation, a line that some women successfully navigated. Rachel Wall's story reveals how female pirates sometimes transitioned between maritime and terrestrial crime. Active in New England waters in the early 1780s, Wall and her husband George reportedly lured ships to their doom by pretending to be in distress. After George's death in a genuine storm in 1782, Rachel apparently abandoned maritime crime but continued as a thief on land. Arrested in 1789 for robbing a woman in Boston, she confessed to her earlier piracy, but was ultimately hanged for the terrestrial robbery. Her execution on October 8, 1789, made her the last woman executed in Massachusetts. Wall's case demonstrates how former female pirates sometimes face justice for later crimes after escaping punishment for their maritime activities. Less well documented but historically significant are women like Mrs. Bear, first name unknown, who joined her pirate husband John Philip Bear on voyages in the late 17th century. Contemporary accounts describe her as frequently donning men's clothing and participating actively in the crew's activities. The ultimate fate of Mrs. Bear remains unrecorded, illustrating the historical gaps that often surround female pirates who lack the notoriety of figures like Bonnie and Reed. Neil Kuyper, also recorded as Cornelia or Nellie Cowper, represents a case of a woman who successfully transitioned from piracy to legitimate, if controversial, business. Dutch by birth, Kuyper reportedly served on merchant ships disguised as a man before being captured by pirates who recruited her for her maritime experience. After her gender was discovered, she was disembarked at Tortuga with her share of plunder. Rather than returning to respectable society, Kuyper established a resort for pirates at Labadee in Haiti, becoming known as the Queen of Labadee Bay until her death during a 1695 raid by English and Spanish forces. Her case illustrates how some female pirates leveraged their criminal connections to establish new lives in the margins of colonial society. The Swedish Baroness Kristina Hanna Skide offers a rare example of an aristocratic woman involved in piracy. Historical records confirm that in 1657, she joined her brother Gustav Skeet, who secretly owned a pirate vessel operating in the Baltic Sea. The siblings preyed on shipping until authorities began closing in, prompting Kristina to flee Sweden in 1663. She eventually returned and retired from piracy in 1668. Court documents confirm her brother's piratical activities, but do not explicitly mention Kristina, creating some historical uncertainty about the extent of her involvement. Her case nonetheless demonstrates how even women of privilege sometimes turn to maritime crime, and how family connections could influence both entry into and exit from piratical activities. Another Swedish woman, Ingela Gathenhielm, illustrates how some women participated in piracy through business rather than direct action at sea. After marrying the ship owner and privateer Lars Gathenhielm in 1711, Ingela became deeply involved in her husband's legitimate privateering business, which reportedly shaded into outright piracy. When Lars died in 1718, Ingela took charge of the operation until 1721. Unlike many female pirates, Gathenhielm never faced prosecution, instead transitioning to legitimate business and dying a respected, wealthy woman in 1729. Her experience highlights how the line between state-sanctioned privateering and illegal piracy often blurred, creating space for women to participate in maritime predation while maintaining social respectability. Maria Lindsay, an English woman active in the mid-18th century, represents one of the more violent female pirates in historical record. Contemporary accounts describe her as a former prostitute who married the pirate Eric Cobham and joined him in assembling a crew. The couple reportedly conducted brutal raids along the New England coast and Newfoundland. Cobham's memoirs portray Lindsay as particularly ruthless with captives. Historical records provide no clear account of her ultimate fate, though some sources suggest the couple eventually retired to France, where Lindsay either committed suicide or was institutionalized due to mental illness brought on by guilt. While these accounts remain unverified, they suggest another potential fate for female pirates: psychological collapse after leaving active piracy. These lesser-known cases reveal several patterns in the treatment of captured female pirates. Women who participated less actively in violence often received more lenient treatment, than their more aggressive counterparts. Family connections, whether to pirate husbands, brothers, or powerful relatives on shore, frequently influenced both how women entered piracy and how they exited it. And perhaps most significantly, female pirates who avoided capture until after abandoning maritime crime generally faced better outcomes than those apprehended during active piracy. Collectively, these cases demonstrate that the fate of female pirates after capture varied significantly based on timing, jurisdiction, perceived level of participation, and social connections. While some faced the same harsh justice as male pirates, others leveraged gender expectations, family influence, or legal ambiguities to secure more favorable outcomes. Their stories complicate any simple narrative about how maritime justice systems responded to women who violated both legal and gender boundaries by taking to piracy. While European and American female pirates operated within relatively similar legal and cultural frameworks, their counterparts in Asia navigated entirely different systems of maritime justice. Nowhere is this distinction more evident than in the stories of the Chinese pirate queens, women who commanded vast fleets and sometimes thousands of followers. Their experiences after capture, or in avoiding capture altogether, reveal how cultural context profoundly shaped the fate of female pirates. The most renowned Chinese female pirate, Zheng Yi Sao, meaning wife of Zheng Yi, also known as Qing Shi, exemplifies how different the outcome could be for women operating in non-Western maritime traditions. Born around 1775, she began her career as a prostitute in Canton before marrying the pirate Zheng Yi in 1801. Unlike Western female pirates who typically joined existing crews, Zheng Yi Sao quickly demonstrated exceptional organizational and leadership abilities, helping her husband unify diverse pirate groups into a formidable confederation known as the Red Flag Fleet. When Zheng Yi died in 1807, his widow did not retire or remarry outside of piracy. Instead, she consolidated control over the entire operation, eventually commanding between 40,000 to 60,000 pirates aboard hundreds of vessels. At the height of her power, Zheng Yi Sao's fleet controlled virtually all pirate activity in the South China Sea, levying taxes on coastal communities and demanding tribute from merchant vessels. The Qing dynasty government, recognizing it could not defeat this formidable force militarily, offered amnesty to pirates willing to surrender in 1810. Zheng Yi Sao negotiated remarkably favorable terms for herself and her followers. She secured pardons for most of her crew, retained a significant portion of her wealth, and even saw some of her subordinates incorporated into the Qing Navy. After surrendering, she opened a gambling house and lived openly as a respected businesswoman until her death at age 69. This outcome stands in stark contrast to the execution or imprisonment that typically awaited Western female pirates. Several factors explain this difference. The Qing dynasty, facing multiple internal challenges, pragmatically preferred co-option to prolonged conflict with pirate forces. Additionally, Chinese maritime traditions included a longer history of women in leadership roles at sea, making female pirate commanders less aberrant than in Western contexts. Another significant Chinese female pirate, Hancho Lo, also recorded as Hancho Lo, active in the early 19th century, similarly avoided the gallows. Operating along the Pearl River Delta, she commanded a fleet of around 64 junks. When imperial forces captured her in 1921, they imprisoned rather than executed her. After her wealthy family paid substantial bribes, authorities released her. She reportedly retired from piracy but maintained connections to maritime criminal networks until her death. The 20th century produced perhaps the most recent well-documented female pirate, Huang Bamei, also known as Huang Pei Mei. Operating during the turbulent period of the Second Sino-Japanese War and Chinese Civil War, 1930s to 40s, Huang led a force that shifted between piracy, anti-Japanese resistance, and eventually anti-communist activities. At her peak, she commanded thousands of fighters who engaged in both patriotic warfare and opportunistic piracy. Unlike earlier Chinese female pirates, Huang faced a modern legal system. When nationalist authorities captured her in 1949, they initially sentenced her to death for piracy. However, her record of anti-Japanese resistance and her willingness to fight communists led to a pardon. She later fled to Taiwan when communist forces took control of mainland China, reportedly working with Taiwanese intelligence services. She died of natural causes in 1982, having transformed from pirate to patriot in official narratives. These cases illustrate several key differences in how Asian maritime justice systems treated female pirates compared to their Western counterparts. First, pragmatic political considerations often outweighed strict legal principles. Second, the option to surrender and integrate into legitimate society remained more accessible, particularly for pirates who commanded significant forces. Third, female leadership at sea, while still unusual, did not represent the same degree of gender transgression as in Western contexts. The maritime traditions of Southeast Asia produced other notable female pirates whose fates diverged from Western patterns. In Vietnam, Bui Thi Xuan commanded naval forces that blurred the line between piracy and legitimate warfare during the Tay Son Rebellion, 1771 to 1802. Though eventually captured and executed, her death came as a military leader rather than as a pirate, illustrating how context shaped both the perception and punishment of female maritime violence. Similar patterns emerge in the Malay archipelago, where women like Kek Eng Cheng led pirate fleets in the Straits of Malacca during the 19th century. Operating within complex networks of maritime raiding communities, these women often negotiated transitions to legitimate authority rather than facing formal judicial proceedings. When captured by colonial powers, they typically faced imprisonment rather than execution, reflecting both different cultural attitudes and the colonial strategy of co-opting rather than eliminating indigenous power structures. These Asian examples illustrate a crucial point. The fate of female pirates after capture was never determined solely by gender and crime, but by the intersection of these factors with cultural context, political expediency, and specific historical circumstances. While Western female pirates primarily faced binary outcomes, execution or reprieve, their Asian counterparts navigated more complex systems that offered additional possibilities, including integration into legitimate power structures. The gap between historical fact and popular perception grows particularly wide when examining what happened to female pirates after capture. This divergence reveals much about how societies process women who step dramatically outside prescribed gender roles. Captain Charles Johnson's 1724 publication, A General History of the Pirates, established the template for much subsequent myth-making around female pirates. His accounts of Anne Bonny and Mary Read, likely based on trial records and first-hand reports, became the foundation for centuries of elaboration and speculation. Johnson wrote of Bonny, "What became of her since, we cannot tell. Only this we know, that she was not executed." This measured acknowledgement of historical uncertainty would give way to increasingly elaborate tales of Bonny's supposed life after piracy. By the early 19th century, popular literature had transformed many female pirates into romantic heroines whose criminality became secondary to their gender transgression. Charlotte Badger, who participated in the 1806 mutiny aboard the colonial brig Venus near Tasmania, exemplifies this process. Historical records confirm her participation in the mutiny, but provide little information about her ultimate fate. This vacuum allowed Victorian writers to create narratives in which Badger variously became the queen of an island tribe, returned to England as a wealthy woman, or lived out her days in a remote New Zealand settlement. The embellishment of female pirate fates reflects cultural anxieties about gender roles. 19th century accounts often ended female pirate stories with either punishment, restoring moral order, or reformation, returning the transgressive woman to proper femininity. Mary Read's death in prison fit the punishment narrative perfectly, while Anne Bonny's uncertain fate allowed writers to imagine her eventual return to respectable society, whether as a wealthy Charleston matron or a reformed Caribbean wife. Court records themselves sometimes contributed to myth-making. The official trial record of Anne Bonny's famous rebuke to Calico Jack, "If you had fought like a man, you need not have been hanged like a dog," may represent actual testimony, or might be a narrative flourish added by the court recorder. Such ambiguities between documentation and dramatization further complicated historical understanding of female pirate fates. The 20th century brought new dimensions to female pirate mythology. As feminist scholars began recovering women's maritime history, figures like Anne Bonny were sometimes recast as proto-feminist rebels. Their ambiguous fates became not just historical mysteries, but symbolic statements about women's resistance to patriarchal control. Meanwhile, popular culture increasingly depicted female pirates as sexually liberated adventurers whose eventual fates mattered less than their temporary freedom from social constraints. These evolving myths reveal changing attitudes toward gender and crime across different historical periods. Victorian accounts emphasized moral lessons. 20th century feminist retellings highlighted resistance to patriarchy, and contemporary popular culture often focuses on female pirates' temporary agency rather than their ultimate punishment or escape. Separating historical reality from mythology remains challenging. While court records provide reliable information about trials and sentences, they often fall silent on ultimate fates, particularly for women who received pregnancy reprieves. This documentary gap has allowed each generation to project its own preoccupations onto these ambiguous historical figures. For many female pirates, male attire represented not merely disguise, but a practical strategy for survival in the hyper-masculine world of seafaring. The practice of cross-dressing significantly influenced how these women were perceived, both during their piratical careers and after capture. Historical records confirm that Mary Read lived as a man for most of her life, beginning in childhood when her mother disguised her to obtain financial support from a paternal grandmother. Her continued male presentation allowed her to serve in both Army and Navy before joining pirate crews. Anne Bonny, though not raised in male disguise, adopted men's clothing aboard Rackham's vessel. Court testimony confirmed both women wore men's jackets and long trousers and handkerchiefs tied about their heads during raids. This gender performance created legal complications after capture. Maritime law conceptualized piracy as a male crime, with statutes using exclusively male pronouns. When obviously female defendants appeared before admiralty courts, judges faced the challenge of applying these laws to individuals who had operated outside gender categories, as well as legal boundaries. Trial records reveal how authorities managed this challenge by emphasizing the defendant's biological sex while acknowledging their male performance. During the trial of Bonny and Read, witnesses were specifically asked to confirm both the women's active participation and their occasional revelation of their true gender. This dual focus established their legal culpability while reinscribing conventional gender categories. For female pirates themselves, cross-dressing created complex questions of identity. Some, like Mary Read, lived as men for decades, raising questions about whether they viewed their male presentation as mere disguise or as genuine identity. Others, like Anne Bonny, appeared to move fluidly between gender presentations depending on circumstance. These nuances affected how women experienced capture and trial when they were forcibly returned to female categorization. After conviction, gender presentation became particularly significant. Women who had lived as men often found themselves compelled to revert to feminine dress and behavior, especially when pleading pregnancy. This forced reversion to conventional femininity represented a form of social control beyond legal punishment, a reassertion of gender boundaries these women had transgressed. Records from colonial prisons indicate that captured female pirates were typically housed in women's quarters, regardless of their previous gender presentation. Mary Read, while imprisoned in Spanish Town, Jamaica, was held with female rather than male prisoners, despite having lived most of her life as a man. This administrative decision prioritized biological sex over lived experience, further reinforcing conventional gender categories. The fate of cross-dressing female pirates thus involved not just legal punishment, but gender repatriation, a forced return to the feminine category they had abandoned. This dimension of their post-capture experience remains understudied, but represents a significant aspect of how maritime justice systems processed women who had violated both legal and gender boundaries. When female pirates did face execution, the events often became public spectacles that reinforced gender norms, even as they punished their violation. The execution of Mary Cricket, or Critchett, in Virginia, in 1729, exemplifies how these events functioned as both judicial punishment and social instruction. Cricket was hanged at Williamsburg on May 16, 1729, alongside her male co-conspirators. Colonial records confirm unusual public interest in the execution, with a larger-than-typical crowd gathering to witness a woman face the gallows for piracy. The Virginia Gazette reported that Cricket died blasphemous and unrepentant, contrasting her with ideals of feminine Christian submission even in death. Public executions of pirates typically included specific rituals designed to reinforce state power and deter others from similar crimes. The bodies of executed pirates were often displayed in gibbets, iron cages suspended in prominent locations, usually near harbors, as warnings to other sailors. However, historical records suggest female pirates were rarely subjected to this post-mortem punishment, reflecting lingering discomfort with publicly displaying female corpses. Executions of female pirates in Europe followed similar patterns of public spectacle and gender reinforcement. The 1726 hanging of Mary Read would have followed standard procedures for pirate executions at London's execution dock had she not died in prison. These procedures included hanging the condemned at a specially shortened gallows, positioned so that high tide would cover the body, symbolically cleansing the shore of the pirate's presence. The condemned were allowed to speak final words, creating opportunities for either penitence or defiance that would be recorded and repeated in broadsides and newspapers. These public rituals served multiple social functions. They demonstrated state power over maritime criminality, reaffirmed gender boundaries by punishing women who had transgressed them, and provided cautionary narratives about the consequences of female rebellion. The relative rarity of female pirate executions amplified their impact as social spectacle and moral instruction. For female pirates who avoided execution, Whether through pregnancy, pardons, or lesser sentences, imprisonment presented its own set of dangers and opportunities. Colonial prisons of the 17th and 18th centuries were notoriously harsh environments where disease, malnutrition, and violence claimed many lives before sentences could be completed. Mary Read's death in a Jamaican prison in April 1721 illustrates these dangers. Historical records attribute her death to a fever, likely typhoid, or a similar prison-bred disease. Her pregnancy, while saving her from the gallows, may have made her more vulnerable to illness by weakening her physical condition. Prison records offer no information about her child's fate, though infant mortality in colonial prisons exceeded 60%. Conditions for female prisoners varied widely across jurisdictions. In British colonial outposts like Jamaica or Barbados, women were typically housed in separate facilities from men, but received similar treatment in terms of provisions and care, meaning inadequate food, minimal medical attention, and crowded, unsanitary conditions. Pirates, as particularly notorious criminals, often received even harsher treatment than ordinary prisoners. Financial resources significantly affected imprisonment experiences. Wealthy prisoners could purchase better food, private cells, and sometimes even preferential treatment from guards. Anne Bonny, if she remained imprisoned after childbirth, might have benefited from her father's wealth to secure better conditions. Less affluent female pirates faced the full brutality of colonial incarceration. For pregnant pirates, childbirth in prison presented particular dangers. Contemporary accounts of women giving birth in colonial prisons described primitive conditions with minimal medical support. Records from Kingston Prison in Jamaica indicate a maternal mortality rate approaching 20% for prison births during the early 18th century. These statistics suggest that pleating the belly represented a calculated risk rather than a guaranteed escape from death. Some female pirates faced transportation rather than traditional imprisonment. Under this punishment, convicts were shipped to colonial territories to serve as indentured laborers. While transportation records rarely specify previous piracy, some historians believe Anne Bonny may have been transported to the American colonies rather than remaining in Jamaica, potentially explaining her disappearance from Jamaican records. Transportation created opportunities as well as hardships. Transported convicts who survived their indentures could potentially establish new identities in colonial societies where their past crimes remained unknown. The American colonies, with their chronic labor shortages and fluid social structures, offered particularly fertile ground for such reinvention. If Bonny or other female pirates were indeed transported, this punishment might have ultimately facilitated their reintegration into legitimate society. Long-term imprisonment remained relatively rare for female pirates. Most either faced execution, died in prison from disease or childbirth complications, received pardons, or were transported. This pattern reflects both the extreme nature of piracy as a crime and the administrative challenges of maintaining women in colonial prison systems designed primarily for male offenders. Not all female pirates faced capture and formal justice. Historical records suggest numerous women participated in piracy without ever standing trial, their stories emerging only through accounts of those who encountered them at sea or through later confessions. These women represent an important counterpoint to the more thoroughly documented cases of captured female pirates. Some women successfully transitioned from piracy to legitimate maritime activity without facing legal consequences. Mary Wolverston, also known as Mary Harbor, daughter of the pirate Philip Wolverston, reportedly participated in her father's piratical activities along the Suffolk coast in the 1650s. When authorities began closing in on the operation, Mary apparently married a respectable ship's captain and abandoned piracy. No record exists of her ever facing charges, suggesting she successfully escaped the legal consequences of her earlier activities. Others fled to regions beyond effective legal jurisdiction. The Caribbean contained numerous small islands and coastal areas where formal authority remained tenuous into the 18th century. Contemporary accounts suggest some female pirates established themselves in these marginal spaces, operating businesses that catered to the pirate economy while avoiding direct participation in piracy that might attract official attention. A significant number of female pirates simply disappear from historical records, their ultimate fates unknown. This documentary silence itself reveals something about how women could sometimes slip through the cracks of maritime justice systems. Female pirates who abandoned their male disguise and returned to conventional feminine presentations became virtually undetectable to authorities searching for pirates described as men in witness accounts. The case of Charlotte Badger illustrates this pattern of historical disappearance. After participating in the 1806 mutiny aboard the colonial brig Venus near Tasmania, Badger simply vanishes from verifiable historical record. Various accounts place her in New Zealand, Tonga, or return to England, but no conclusive evidence confirms any of these outcomes. Her ability to disappear so completely suggests how women could sometimes exploit period assumptions about gender to avoid capture. Some female pirates leveraged political changes or shifting jurisdictional boundaries to escape justice. During periods of colonial transition, when authority passed from one European power to another, administrative records often suffered disruption that created opportunities for pirates to reinvent themselves as respectable colonists. The period between Dutch and English rule in New Amsterdam, New York, 1664 to 1674, saw several known pirates, including at least 2 women, successfully integrate into the new colonial society without facing punishment for earlier crimes. Women who participated in piracy as shore-based accomplices, receiving stolen goods, providing information about ship movements, or laundering pirate proceeds, proved particularly difficult for authorities to prosecute. While male pirates operating at sea left witnesses who could testify against them in court, women whose participation remained land-based often avoided creating similar evidence. The legal concept of accessory to piracy existed, but required specific evidence that prosecutors often couldn't obtain for female accomplices. These cases of escape from justice complicate any simple narrative about how female pirates fared after their maritime careers. While some faced the gallows and others languished in prison, a significant number apparently succeeded in avoiding formal punishment altogether. Their stories, though less thoroughly documented than those who faced trial, form an essential part of understanding the complex interaction between gender, crime, and justice in maritime communities. Perhaps the most intriguing category of female pirate fates involves those who successfully reintegrated into legitimate society after their maritime criminal careers. While historical documentation of these cases remains limited, sufficient evidence exists to establish that some women managed to transition from piracy to respectability, often by leveraging gender expectations and social connections. Anne Bonny represents the most famous potential case of successful reintegration, though historians continue to debate her ultimate fate. The predominant theory, supported by property records and family histories, suggests she returned to Charlestown, now Charleston, South Carolina, where her father's wealth and influence facilitated her re-entry into colonial society. Some sources indicate she married a local man named Joseph Burleigh around 1721 to 22 and had at least 8 children, living until 1782. This narrative remains contested, but if accurate, it demonstrates how family connections and wealth could sometimes override criminal history, particularly for women whose gender allowed them to be conceptualized as led astray rather than inherently criminal. Better documented is the case of Mary Harley, also recorded as Marie Harley, who participated in piracy along the Barbary coast in the 1630s. After capture by Spanish authorities in 1633, Harley claimed to be a noblewoman who had been forced into piracy by her husband. Though this claim appears dubious given witness accounts of her active participation in raids, Spanish officials ultimately accepted her plea. After a brief imprisonment, she married a Spanish merchant and reportedly lived out her days as a respectable Seville matron. Her case illustrates how gender expectations could sometimes be strategically deployed by female pirates to secure second chances denied to their male counterparts. The most successful reintegrations likely involved women who had maintained their respectability while engaging in piracy through family businesses. Angela Gathenhill, who operated what was effectively a pirate fleet under the thin disguise of Swedish privateering letters, never faced prosecution, despite widespread knowledge of her activities. After her husband's death, she gradually transitioned their operation toward legitimate shipping and trade, eventually becoming a respected businesswoman in Gothenburg. Her experience demonstrates how the blurred line between privateering and piracy created space for women to move between criminal and legitimate maritime enterprise without facing legal consequences. Female pirates who reintegrated into society typically employed one of several strategies: leveraging family connections, claiming coercion or ignorance, exploiting jurisdictional ambiguities, or gradually transitioning from illegal to legal maritime activities. These strategies proved more accessible to women than to men, reflecting period assumptions about female agency and culpability. Successful reintegration, however, typically required significant resources. Women with wealth, education, or powerful family connections possessed advantages in reconstructing legitimate identities after piracy. Women lacking these resources faced greater challenges in escaping their criminal pasts, even if they managed to avoid formal punishment. The stories of these second lives remain the most elusive aspect of female pirate history. By definition, successful reintegration involved obscuring one's piratical past, creating inherent challenges for historical documentation. The women who most completely escaped the consequences of their maritime crimes may well be those whose stories remain entirely unknown, their piracy unrecorded, their transitions to respectability unremarkable, their ultimate fates indistinguishable from those of women who never sailed under the black flag. The treatment of female pirates after capture established legal precedents that influenced maritime justice systems well beyond the golden age of piracy. These cases forced courts to consider how gender intersected with criminal responsibility, creating jurisprudence that would shape subsequent trials of women accused of traditionally male crimes. Perhaps the most significant legal legacy emerged from the application of pregnancy reprieves in piracy cases. The high-profile stays of execution granted to Anne Bonny and Mary Read reinforced the principle that pregnancy provided temporary protection from capital punishment. This principle gradually expanded beyond its original narrow application, contributing to broader reconsideration of women's punishment in Western legal systems. By the late 18th century, courts increasingly commuted death sentences for women regardless of pregnancy status, reflecting evolving attitudes that the Bonny and Read cases had helped catalyze. Female piracy cases also influenced the development of legal doctrines regarding women's criminal responsibility. The rejection of coercion defenses in several prominent trials, including those of Bonnie, Reed, and Cricket, helped establish that women could be held fully accountable for crimes committed alongside men. This principle gradually extended beyond maritime law into broader criminal jurisprudence, contributing to the slow erosion of legal doctrines that presumed female submission to male authority. Culturally, the stories of female pirates captured during the Golden Age shaped public understanding of gender and crime for centuries. Published accounts of their trials became bestsellers, while theatrical productions based on their lives drew crowds throughout the 18th and 19th centuries. These cultural representations typically emphasized the exceptional nature of female piracy, reinforcing rather than challenging broader gender norms by presenting women like Bonnie and Reed as aberrations rather than harbingers of changing gender roles. The ambiguous fates of many female pirates, particularly the unresolved question of what ultimately happened to Anne Bonny, created space for ongoing cultural reinterpretation. Each generation has reimagined these women according to contemporary preoccupations. Victorians emphasized moral redemption or justified punishment. Early 20th century feminists highlighted resistance to patriarchal constraints, and modern interpretations often focus on sexual and gender fluidity. The legacy of female pirate cases extends into modern maritime law as well. The precedents established in these early trials, particularly regarding jurisdictional questions and standards of evidence, continue to influence how contemporary courts approach cases of maritime crime. The principle that piracy represents a crime against all nations, clearly articulated in the trials of female pirates during the Golden Age, remains a cornerstone of international maritime law. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of these cases lies in how they demonstrated the contingent nature of gender in legal settings. Female pirates forced courts to confront the gap between legal categories based on biological sex and the more complex reality of gender as performance and identity. This tension, though not articulated in modern terms during historical trials, nonetheless established important precedents for later legal considerations of gender identity and its relationship to criminal responsibility. The treatment of female pirates after capture thus represents more than a historical curiosity. It constitutes a crucial chapter in the development of gendered jurisprudence in maritime societies. Their exceptional status as women who had violated both legal and gender boundaries created legal dilemmas that required courts to articulate principles that would influence the treatment of criminalized women for centuries to come. The fate of female pirates after capture reveals as much about historical societies as it does about the women themselves. Through their exceptional lives and deaths, figures like Anne Bonny, Mary Read, and their lesser-known counterparts illuminate the complex interplay between gender, justice, and maritime culture across different periods and regions. What emerges from this historical investigation is not a simple narrative of universal oppression or liberation, but rather a nuanced picture of how women navigated multiple systems of constraint and opportunity. Female pirates faced severe punishment when captured, yet sometimes leveraged gendered assumptions to secure outcomes unavailable to their male counterparts. They operated in hyper-masculine environments that typically excluded women, yet occasionally found in these spaces a freedom unavailable in legitimate society. The legal records, trial transcripts, and historical accounts examined throughout this exploration reveal several key patterns. First, the treatment of female pirates varied significantly by time, place, and individual circumstance. Women who commanded their own vessels or who operated in Asian maritime traditions often faced different consequences than those who served on predominantly male crews in Western contexts. Wealthy women with powerful connections typically secured better outcomes than their less privileged counterparts. And women who could claim pregnancy gained access to legal mechanisms that sometimes transformed temporary reprieves into permanent escapes from justice. Second, gender functioned as both constraint and a resource for captured female pirates. Their gender initially marked them as exceptional criminals who had violated natural as well as legal boundaries. Yet this same exceptionality sometimes created openings for mercy not extended to male pirates. The complex interplay between gender transgression and gender conformity shaped every aspect of how female pirates experienced capture and its aftermath. Third, the stories of female pirates after capture have been continuously reinterpreted to serve changing cultural needs. From 18th century morality tales to modern feminist reclamations, these narratives have been deployed to reinforce, challenge, or complicate prevailing gender norms. The significant gaps in historical record, especially regarding the ultimate fates of figures like Anne Bonny, have created space for ongoing reinterpretation, allowing these women to serve as vessels for evolving ideas about gender, crime, and justice. The most accurate historical assessment may be that female pirates occupied an inherently unstable position in both maritime culture and legal systems. Their existence challenged fundamental assumptions about gender roles, even as they operated within constraints defined by those same assumptions. This contradiction created both vulnerabilities and opportunities when they faced capture and trial, producing the diverse outcomes documented throughout this exploration. As we navigate our own evolving understanding of gender and justice, the stories of female pirates after capture continue to resonate. They remind us that gender has always been more complex than legal or social categories can fully capture, that justice systems inevitably reflect and reinforce prevailing power structures, and that individual women have long found ways to navigate, resist, and sometimes transcend the limitations imposed upon them. The waves of change set in motion by these exceptional women continue to ripple through legal and cultural understanding. Their stories, recovered from trial transcripts, prison records, newspaper accounts, and sometimes the silences between these sources, offer valuable perspective on how societies process those who transgress multiple boundaries simultaneously. In their captures, trials, punishments, and occasional escapes, we glimpse not just the fate of female pirates, but the complex interplay of gender and justice that continues to shape our world today.